Hey friends, my name is Steve Guttenberg. That guy over there, his name is Scott. So you're an audiophile, right?
I'm an audiophile, Steve.
Good.
I am unapologetically, proudly an audiophile. Yeah.
Good. We got that out of the way right up front. Good. I could kind of tell looking around the room here at this stuff.
There's some dead giveaways, right?
Yeah,
You know,
yeah. Feels like audiophile stuff to me. So, but how did it happen? Why did you become an audiophile? Or buy audio? You didn't start out as an audiophile.
Yeah, sure. I mean, everybody's got their journey in. So, growing up in the 80s and 90s, I had cassettes and then CDs, and I just had some friends in high school who were like, very much into gear and car audio and home audio and things like that. And vinyl was a big part of my journey as an audiophile because that friend got me into vinyl. And so like in the 90s, I started hearing vinyl for the first time and being like, oh, this sounds different from what I've been hearing my whole life. And so I started getting into, I bought my first record player, like a little Yamaha turntable with a Grado cartridge. And then that was part of my dorm room system when I went to college, with some Paradigm Titans and a little Yamaha receiver. And so I think it was like that kind of being exposed to vinyl, being exposed to like better sounding stuff and like getting caught up in that crafting of your system and tailoring it to your tastes and your needs and creating this aesthetic experience that like, goes beyond just the music itself and into the experiential kind of piece of things. I just got really into it.
But it's that funny thing that your first system, it's like your first love, right? It's like, oh, I had so much fun, and every time I bought a record or whatever, it just blew me away. And then a lot of people, as they age, it's like trying to get back to that joy, when it was more innocent. It was, for you or each person, right? It was just like.
Totally. Yeah, no, I think there's that, that time and place. And so like that system for me, that like one that I talk about longingly, like a lost love or whatever, is this system I got my sophomore year of college when I was first exposed to getting credit. So totally overspent, like beyond my means, and bought a pair of Snell J4 speakers, four standing speakers.
Good start.
Incredible sounding speakers. I bought a Jolita SJ502A integrated amp. And then Jolita at that time made I think it was like 602 CD player, which was like literally this like Sanyo CD player that they had like grafted a tube output stage onto, but that still sounded incredible. And then with that Yamaha table, and like, man, it sounded really good. And like, I love it. And sometimes I think like, I'll never have a system that sounded as good as that system did in that moment to me at that time.
Right. But to have that intense connection to it.
Totally, yeah. There's still some DNA of that system in my stereo. I have the Doge or Doge or however you pronounce it, tube DAC, which is designed by the guy who was making all of that Jolita stuff in the 90s.
Ah, okay. Your speakers, these are relatively new, right?
Yeah, so these were a pandemic purchase.
As
was
they're Eggleston.
Yeah, they're EgglestonWorks Kivas.
Okay.
So I had the EgglestonWorks Emmas, which I had bought in 2018 probably, and I just loved them. They sounded incredible. They were the closest I had found in terms of like what I had liked about those Snell J4s back in the day, just like cloth dome tweeter and just a very like organic, non-fatiguing. You could listen to them for hours. And so during the pandemic, I was like everybody, I was like listening to my stereo so much. Right. And I was like, I'm going to move up in the line, just one step in the line. And so I bought these sight unseen. I kind of measured. I had a sense that they were a little bit bigger, but they showed up and they are, they're about the size of me. And so I about had a panic attack because I was like, oh my gosh, I've let a wild animal into my apartment because they had so much punch and so much low extension and stuff like that. I was like, these are the wrong speakers for a New York apartment. But they sound so good.
So who was the dealer?
Well, so the Emmas I had bought from Stereo Exchange here in New York. Love those guys. They just recently sold me this rack of silence behind me that you see. But the Kivas I bought used, so I had found a guy who was selling a pair that were barely used, and I bought them from him.
And your turntable, you got a pretty serious turntable.
Yeah, really happy with this. So this I bought a few years ago. Again, probably around the same time. I've kind of like turned over my entire stereo in the last 4 years or 5 years. So yeah, so it's an Avid Volvere. You don't see them very often in the US, which is kind of fun. I actually bought it because it was also used, it was on Audiogon, but it had an SME5 arm on it.
Wow.
And so I was like, oh, for the price, for that arm, like this is a bargain. So even though I've never heard this table before,
Right.
and there's not many, I was like, at least I know this arm's going to be great. And
you buy the arm and the turntable's free.
Yeah, exactly. Honestly, for the price I paid, you know, that's about right. Yeah, the phono preamp. So another thing I just changed recently. So as I was kind of downsizing to this rack from the kind of rack that I had before, I had the PS Audio Stellar phono stage, which was great. But I wanted to reduce components, and so I actually got the, so I have the Aesthetix Minas integrated amp.
Oh, okay.
And they make a really fantastic phono card for it. So I bought the phono card from Audio Connection in New Jersey, Johnny over there, and it sounds amazing, just stunningly good, just so present, so organic and great, like everything I look for from analog. So. Thrilled. They know what they're doing at Aesthetix.
And it's tubes, right?
It's yes. So there's a lot of tubes in my system. So the Mimas is a hybrid. It's got a Class A/B amplifier with two tubes on the input side, and then the DAC is all tube as well. But yeah, it's the Doge 7 DAC. So it's an ESS Sabre-based DAC that has 8 vacuum tubes in it, which you can imagine is a lot of fun if one of the tubes starts to go microphonic, trying to figure out which tube it is.
Tapping with a pencil.
Yeah, exactly. But fully balanced, everything in the system's fully balanced. It sounds really good. They advertise it as the DAC that sounds like a turntable. You know, just clearly they must subscribe.
Yeah. You know, really good digital sounds like analog.
Yeah, exactly.
Analog, really good analog. What does that sound like?
Oh. You know, a really good. I was thinking about this the other day because with this new SoundSmith cartridge, I was texting my friend who's also an audiophile, and I was like, oh my gosh, it sounds like tape.
There you go.
So even more analog. It sounds even more analog.
Closer to the source.
Yeah,
absolutely. So when did you start buying? You started buying records as a kid?
Yeah, so as a teenager. So yeah, when I was probably 16 or 17. Trying to think. So some of my first records were like Nine Inch Nails. You know, I bought their first 2 albums on vinyl. Like an early Smashing Pumpkins record. So, you know, buying the like 90s rock that I was into and just like getting really into it. But then what was great about that era is, man, you should see some of the price tags that I have on these records, right? Because I'm like buying them from like thrift stores and stuff like that. I mean, I own every record David Bowie ever made, and a good third of them I bought back then, and they're all like, you know, really good 70s and 80s pressings that I got for $4 or $5 a piece that, you know, are now like $40, $50. Yeah. It was a fun era because you could actually go to Goodwill and find, you know, some really great stuff. So there's still a lot. It's still well represented. Like I've still got a lot of records from that era that I bought as a thrifty teenager.
I mean, I think you know, just the memories of where you bought a specific album. You know, you hold it in your hand. Oh yeah, I remember that day when I bought that, and I also got this. You know, I think that's the thing about physical media beyond how it sounds and holding it in your hand. I think the connections of where you bought it, assuming you bought it at a brick and mortar store, is part of it. Because I have so many of my records that I bought 50 plus years ago. And I can't say I have memories for every single one, but for many of them I do, you know. So they become precious to me that there's no need to get a mobile fidelity pressing. Because we're going to talk a little bit about the whole mobile fidelity thing, you know. But it's like, I don't know, I like this one kind of deal. So I'm kind of okay, even though it's got some clicks and pops because I played it, you know, when I was 17 years old.
Yeah.
But I always took actually pretty good care of my records, so that was never an issue.
Yeah, same.
Taking good care of records, meaning you put it back in the jacket after you play it. Yeah, so we were talking before we started that you actually own a lot of mobile fidelity records, including one steps and stuff. So how do you feel about the whole debacle?
My feelings are complicated about it. I mean, look, like they sound great. Like I've got some Bob Dylan records that you can probably see right there. Some Miles Davis, a lot of the Miles Davis mobile fidelities, and they sound incredible. So like no shade at all to what they're doing over there. But there's this thing about records for me that is more than just do they sound good or do they not sound good. It's the romanticization of that chain of custody that goes into a record, that like, you know, that in the 1960s, Miles Davis was in a room and he was blowing in his trumpet and it was making a diaphragm on a microphone vibrate, and it created an electrical wave that was captured onto a tape and then pressed onto a piece of plastic, and then putting that 50-year-old piece of plastic on my record player, I can feel like I'm in the room. And so I feel like they're breaking that chain of custody in a way that makes it a little less fun and a little less romantic. I get why they're doing it. I mean, you know, because Mobile Fidelity never did represses before. Now they're doing represses. This is probably part of the reason why they can do that. The one-step process obviously is, you know, very elaborate and involved, and you know, they're not going to let you just keep spinning those master tapes over and over again. So I get it. I get why they were doing it, but I do feel a little bit misled. You know, I would have made some different decisions. Maybe some of these like late 60s, early 70s Miles Davises, I would have sought out, you know, good first pressings of them instead of getting the Mobile Fidelity. But I'm not in the street burning them, or you know.
And you're not going to boycott them.
No, I'm not going to boycott them, but I'm going to be. I'm glad they're being transparent. That, you know, they're already starting to, you know, even since you posted your last video, they're now kind of publishing the kind of mastering process that went into each record, which honestly is great. Like, that's something everybody should be doing. I wish everybody in the industry did it. So yeah, I'll still get. I just bought the new the repress of the Natalie Merchant Tiger Lily, great 90s record, and it sounds great. But to be fair, when you're slapping original master recording across the top of every one of your records, you're making a statement. You're setting expectations.
Yeah. So here's a question. Do you think? I mean, it seems like you've arrived at a certain place, right? Like you're really good now, right, in terms of the gear and.
Yeah, I've never been happier. I mean, you know, there's room for improvement. I think the DAC's probably my weak spot in my setup, and I, you know, think about, you know, maybe getting one of those hollow audio DACs or something like that. But yeah, very, very happy with where I'm at.
But do you think you have like a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan of where you would want to go from here?
Ooh, that's a great question. You know, I think that I think that when I was looking back and kind of thinking about like, oh, every piece of stereo gear that I've ever owned, and, you know, some of the wrong turns I made along the way or whatever, like I got very into 5-channel audio in the early 2000s, like, oh, like terrible mistake. But when I think about that, like I look at especially my early years when I was kind of like changing just for the sake of changing things. You know, I got bored with a certain pair of speakers, and so you know, those J4s, I traded them for a pair of Vandersteens, which I regretted immediately, and then a pair of Magnapans, which I loved but were difficult to place, all these kinds of things. But it was a lot of deck chairs on the Titanic kind of thing, you know what I mean? It was change for the sake of change and lacking strategy. I feel like now I've got a good strategy of like, okay, if I'm going to make a change, it's going to be to move up, and I'm going to like very kind of deliberately move up. But I'm definitely getting to the point of diminishing returns on things, you know, where it's like, oh, like where would I go from here? Like I could do separates, you know what I mean? Like I have an integrated amp, that's kind of a compromise. Maybe get into the Aesthetix separates. Could be a you know, maybe like in my medium-term plan. I do think these speakers, I love them so much. They're probably too big for a Manhattan apartment. So I have talked a little bit to Stereo Exchange, possibly about getting some Sonus Faber, maybe bookshelves, or they're like the smaller, like Olympic Nova floor standers or something like that. That might be a little easier to control. Because the challenge with these is that you have very limited placement options in a, you know, in a small apartment. And so, you know, when I measure this, because I have a measurement mic and I do a lot of tweaking based on that, there's a room mode around 60 hertz, and I know that if I could move the speakers out couple feet, that room mode would go away, but I can't do it. They're stuck where they are. So yeah, so I think those are kind of the things on my mind, and those are non-urgent 3 to 5 year kind of changes.
Yeah, I just started thinking about that this morning, because, you know, I've talked about that it's not always like a progression moving forward. You know, it can be a progression backwards. In other words, something retro. You know, like a 1960s Macintosh preamp. So, because when I had that C22 that I did a review on, which was it was going to be the last Macintosh tube preamp, because they said, we're done with tubes. From now on, solid state is the future, and we're done, right? So this was the peak of Macintosh tube preamp technology in 1962. And I reviewed that. Now, there was a lot of ifs, ands, or buts about that thing. But it was very tubey and very big and fat and juicy and just great. Accuracy, schmaccuracy. It just sounded good, you know? And for me, I like tubes that sound tubey. You know, if I want solid state, I'll just use solid state. So it's kind of like when digital starts to sound good, it sounds like analog. Yeah, when tubes start to sound like solid state, it's like, why bother? But in any case, I think making changes to a system where you go, you know, back. This really hit me hard a couple of years ago at Directstream when I was doing a story about vintage, and they had some 1970s tannoy Ardens with 15-inch coaxial drivers, and it was one of those experiences. It changed me because I said listening to a speaker with a 15-inch driver is different. It has more weight to it, you know. And I remember I kept moving back because Directstream is a long store, right?
Yep.
So I started out maybe 10 feet away from the speakers, and then I got back 20 feet away, and then I was like 30 feet away. I just played them louder the further back I got. I said, this speaker just has no sense of like stress as it gets louder and louder. It just fills more and more of the room. And that's what led to me eventually getting the Klipsch Cornwalls as my current thing, because I said, I want to live with a speaker with a 15-inch woofer.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying some version of that you come up with something like, I'd like to be able to live with X, you know. And maybe we're in the present where, you know, you can't say how much better things are going to be 5 years or 10 years from now, but you can say, I can take a step back and live with something vintage.
Yeah, and I can see the appeal of that. Well, like you said about things that sound tubey, like I don't super duper care about accuracy. I want something that sounds musical and alive and things like that. And I think, you know, I think back on that Jolita setup that I mentioned earlier longingly, and like it was that setup. It was just unapologetically tubey. It was just, you know, you know, very kind of new in that, you know, the 90s, like, you know, these like all tube amps, you know, like they really wanted to make a statement, and it was a very tubey sounding setup. And yeah, I could totally see the appeal of getting back to a system with output tubes and things like that.
It's you know, it's really complicated, and that's what makes it interesting and fun over the years and decades for people, because it's still elusive as to what it is that makes music sound, let's say, not 100% real, but closer to. You know, it's not so easy to define. You know?
There's this really great interview with John Curl, famed amplifier designer, and he talks about measurements and how he uses measurements and things like that. And he said something that's always stuck with me, which is that measurements should be used to explain what we're hearing. I feel like a lot of people use it the other way around. They say, "Oh, we don't have a measurement for that, therefore you can't hear that."
Right.
You know what I mean? But it should be like, "Oh no, I hear this. This sounds different when I change this thing, but it doesn't measure better, but it sounds different. It sounds better. What is it?" You know, there's probably some measurement out there that just doesn't exist for that. But
right.
In the meantime, we got these things, which, you know, do a pretty good job.
Yeah, I'd say. Yeah, I mean, because, you know, forget about the technology. The art of making recordings that sound good. I'm trying to think if anybody in the 21st century is making recordings that sound good in the sense of that feeling of people playing together in a room better than they did in the 50s or 60s or 70s. You know, I don't really think so.
Yeah, that's a lost art. You know, that's you know, I think music has gotten so produced, and like that, you know, the producer has become the kind of auxiliary member of the band, and you know that it's, you know,
that was kind of true before.
Yeah, but I think that was the trend, right? I mean, I think it kind of started with that, and then everybody was like, "Oh, I want to do what Brian Eno is doing," and so everybody suddenly is like, you know, overproducing everything, like a million overdubs. And I think that was something that you got with digital that you didn't have before, which is that you could do, you know, like Billy Corgan can go in and he can overdub the same guitar part 40 times. Like, you couldn't do that before,
Right,
without.
I mean, in terms of creative ideas, it's fantastic. I'm not trying to make that's the only way, that way is the best way, and all other ways are inferior. Not really. No, it's all different. But Eno once said, speaking of Brian Eno, he said, "I wish it was a synthesizer with 2 knobs." Up, down, up, down. That's it. Anyway, I think we've done it.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Scott. This is fantastic. So anyway, I got to remember to take pictures of all your stuff.
Please do. And you got to hear it, too, before you leave.
I hear it, too.
Yeah.
Oh, that's true. Anyway, we will continue. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve.